and welcome to this tutorial. Today we'll look at working with gradients in Adobe Illustrator CC or Adobe Illustrator version 23. I specifically mention the version of Illustrator as this is when the new Freeform Gradient is introduced. In version 23 and beyond, we have the option of applying 4 types of gradients: linear, radial, freeform with points, and freeform with lines. I think of the freeforms as radial freeform or linear freeforms. Let's get started. Today we'll work with the gradient panel, not to be confused with the gradient tool. We'll look at the gradient tool in another video. Click on the gradient panel. If you don't see it in your workspace, choose Window from the menu and select Gradient. By default, a black and white gradient is presented in the active or previously used gradient. If we click on the triangle to its right, we'll see a list of gradients that are currently in our Swatches panel. For now, let's select the sky gradient. We have the fill-in stroke selectors, the reverse gradient button. Watch what happens on either the gradient annotator or on our rectangle when we click this button. The color bar or gradient annotator displays color stops along its bottom edge and midpoint diamonds along the top. A midpoint diamond is the halfway blend spot between the two colors directly below and to the left or right of it. And as you can see, can be easily adjusted. To add a color stop, hover your mouse approximately where you want your new color to be along the bottom edge of the annotator. Click once and your new color stop will appear. In the color panel, you can choose from the color palette, the swatches panel, or you can use the eyedropper to pick up a color from your canvas or background. You get to the color panel by double-clicking on a color stop. To remove a color stop, simply select it and holding the mouse button down, drag away from the color bar. Or select the color stop and click on the garbage can. Note also, when a color stop is selected, you can grab the eyedropper from this panel. On the top right corner of the panel, there's a toggle to show or hide options. Next, we can select the type of gradient, linear, radial, or freeform. So far, we've been working with gradients as a fill option. You can also apply gradients to the stroke of an object. That is, you can apply a linear or radial gradient to a stroke. You cannot apply freeform to strokes just yet. When you apply a gradient to a stroke, you have 3 options for how it's applied: within the stroke, along the stroke, and across the stroke. We'll look at those options in a bit. When you're using a linear gradient, you also have the option of changing its angle. Notice the aspect ratio is dimmed. It's only available to radial gradients. We can change the opacity of a color stop and specify its location. One thing I will touch on in this video is that if you're using the gradient tool instead of the gradient panel, it allows you to see the changes you make in real time. Notice when I adjust the color stop from the gradient panel, the changes are not reflected in my object until I release the mouse button. Okay, let's move on. Selecting my second object, I'll apply a radial gradient. As you would expect, the gradient grows in a circular manner from the inside to the outside. Another thing to note is that you can save linear and radial gradients to a document's swatches panel. You cannot do this with the new Freeform Gradients. To do this, ensure the object with the gradient fill or stroke is selected, then drag the fill or stroke indicator behind the last pattern swatch on your swatches panel. Now let's take a look at the new Freeform Gradients. Remember, you can only apply a linear or a radial gradient to strokes. Freeform gradients can only be applied to the fill of an object. With our object selected, we'll open the gradient panel and apply a freeform gradient. Before we do anything else, we need to decide if we want a freeform radial or a freeform linear gradient. Let's choose freeform radial or a points gradient. Our color stops exist within our object as a point where we're able to change its opacity, color, and spread. When a point is selected, it's surrounded by a dashed line that contains a dark circle. We can click and drag this circle to change the color spread around each point. We can also drag each color spot or point anywhere we want within our object. To add a new point, hover over the approximate location within your object, click once, and your new color stop appears. Double-click to modify the color, opacity, and spread options. Follow along as I make a few changes. Now let's try the freeform linear gradient. I'll select my object, choose freeform from the gradient panel, and lines as my gradient subtype. By default, I get the same 4 points as in our last example. Let's remove them by clicking on each point and dragging it off the object. To create our freeform line, start by clicking once within the object, and as you would with the pen tool, click and drag to create your shape. Each time you click the mouse, you'll create a new color stop along the path you're creating. You can close the path by clicking on the first color stop, or you can leave it open. You can also have multiple paths within an object. Let's play around and have some fun with this one. The difference between the two freeform gradients is very similar to the difference between linear and radial gradients. It's all in how the blend either emanates from inside a circle to the outer side or from one end of a line to the other. And remember, at this time, you cannot save a freeform gradient to a document swatches panel. And you cannot apply a freeform gradient to the stroke of an object. To demonstrate, I'll select each circle and either apply a gradient to its fill by choosing the object, then clicking on the saved linear or radial gradients from within the swatches panel, or in the case of both of the freeform gradients, I'll rebuild them from scratch. I'm going to fast forward this section for the sake of brevity, but feel free to pause or slow it down if you want to. Okay, let's now look at applying gradients to the stroke of an object. As mentioned before, we can apply them within, along, or across the stroke, and we can apply either a linear or a radial gradient. With our first stroke selected, I'll apply a linear gradient and choose within the stroke. In this case, our gradient begins at the leftmost side of the entire object or stroke and continues across it to the furthermost right side. It does not follow the path the stroke was created along. In the second example, we'll look at a linear gradient using the along the stroke setting. Note the gradient starts at the beginning of the drawn path and follows along the entire path. Our third example is a linear gradient using the across the stroke setting. Let me zoom in so we can see this one a little better. Notice our gradient now starts on one side of the stroke and continues across it. Let's reverse our gradient. Okay, we'll zoom back out and apply a radial stroke to each and see what we get. Our first stroke will have a radial gradient with the within the stroke setting. It seems to me center of the entire width of our path is found and the gradient radiates outward from there. Our second example, or radial gradient using the along the stroke setting, appears to begin at the middle of our furthermost right spot. This, of course, is more of a guess than factual. I have not been able to find any documentation stating that. Let's move on to the third example. Applying a radial gradient using the across the stroke setting gives us some pretty cool results. That's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and that you've learned something new today. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up, share with your friends, and leave me a comment below. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and click on the bell icon to be notified when new videos are posted. Don't forget to check out our website where you can find other free stuff like seamless patterns, deco toners, Illustrator brushes, and page borders. That's at www.lillizzy.net. Cheers!